The night Celestina de Luca walked out on Damiano Vasquez, she didn't cry. She checked her lipstick in the hallway mirror, adjusted the diamond he had given her the winter before the bullet, and told the housekeeper to roll the chair far from the balcony so he couldn't do anything foolish. Then she smiled the way a woman smiles when free of it. Behind her, in a wheelchair that still smelled of new leather, sat the man who had once owned half the shipping lanes of Port Halden. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't chase her. He couldn't lift his voice. Pride had welded his jaw shut. He only watched the click of her heels grow smaller and smaller until the front door closed and the great house fell into the kind of silence that eats a man alive. Who was the quiet, curvy woman standing in the shadow of the staircase, watching him with a look no one had dared give him in 20 years? And why, of all the nights in a long and bitter year, had she chosen this one to step forward and speak? Damiano Vasquez had been a king for so long that he had forgotten kings could bleed. The bullet had come from a black sedan on a rainy Tuesday in March, fired through the seam of a bulletproof coat by a man who knew where the fabric thinned. The slug had drilled into the small of his back, clipped the cord, and turned the lower half of him into a country he could no longer visit. The doctors used careful words. They spoke of incomplete lesions and long odds and something called neuroplasticity, a language invented to make hopeless men sit still. In the weeks that followed, he learned that a body without legs is heavier than a body with them, that a ceiling becomes very familiar, and that the people who had once bowed to him now spoke to the top of his head as if he were a child in a high chair. Celestina had been beautiful about it at first. She had arranged the pillows. She had held the cup to his mouth. She had told the reporters that love was stronger than any injury. But love, Damiano learned, is a currency that spends fastest when the man carrying it can no longer walk to the bank. By June, she had stopped sleeping in the room. By July, she had stopped pretending. By August, she had hired Ruth Callahan to do what a fiancé will not do for a man she has decided to bury while he still breathes. Ruth Callahan was 34 years old, born in a hollow outside Corbin, Kentucky, and built like a woman who had spent a decade lifting patients heavier than herself. She wasn't slim in the way magazines demanded, and had stopped apologizing for it around the time her husband, a coal inspector, died in a mine collapse and left her with a mortgage and a refusal to be pitied. She had come north for the pay, 3 weeks after the bank had sent its second letter about the mortgage, with a duffel bag and a folded photograph of her late husband tucked into a Bible she no longer read. The agency told her the client was a private gentleman recovering from a spinal injury, discreet family, generous salary, live-in room above the garage. They did not tell her the gentleman had once been on the front page of every newspaper on the eastern seaboard, or that the discreet family was, in truth, one bitter woman planning her escape. Ruth found out inside a week, from the whispers of the gardener, the sideways glances of the cook, and the black cars that came and went at hours no honest business kept. She did not run. She had buried a husband and raised 2 brothers on nurses' aid wages, and had learned that most monsters up close are only men who have forgotten how to ask for help. On her first morning in the Vasquez house, she pushed open the door of the master suite, saw the man in the chair by the window, and did not lower her eyes. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Vasquez. My name is Ruth. I'll be looking after you." He stared at her for a long moment, the way a wolf stares at a farmer who has walked into its den with only a bucket. Then he said, in a voice rusted from disuse, "Everyone else calls me sir." And Ruth, without blinking, said, "Everyone else isn't the one changing your sheets. Good morning, Mr. Vasquez." Something inside him, something that had been clenched for months, loosened one notch. He didn't smile. He wouldn't smile for weeks. But he didn't send her away, and in the house of Damiano Vasquez, that was the beginning of everything. The first days were a war of small things. Damiano had learned, from Celestina and the nurses before her, that a paralyzed man is spoken about in the third person, even when he is present in the room. Ruth refused to play. She narrated everything before she did it. "I'm going to lift your right leg now, Mr. Vasquez, because the heel is starting to redden, and I don't want to sore. I'm going to open the window because the air in here is heavy, and you deserve to smell the ocean." I'm going to shave you today because a man who hasn't seen his own jaw in a month starts to forget who he is. He hated her for it at first. He hated the way she said his name as if it belonged to a person and not a legend. He hated the way she hummed old country hymns under her breath while she rolled him from one side to the other. He hated most of all that she looked at him, not at the chair, not at the useless legs, not at the scar that ran like a purple river down his lower back, but at his eyes, steady, unafraid, the way a woman looks at a man she has decided is worth the trouble. On the fourth night, when the pain in his hips woke him at 3 a.m, and he tried to reach the call bell and knocked it to the floor instead, she came anyway, barefoot, hair in a braid, and she sat on the edge of his bed and repositioned him without a word. When she was done, she stayed a moment longer than she needed to, and she said, "You don't have to be quiet, Mr. Vasquez. If it hurts, it hurts. There's nobody in this room but us." He turned his face to the wall so she would not see the water on it, and he learned, in the dark, that a grown man can weep without shame if the woman beside him has already decided he is still a man. In the morning, he asked her, for the first time, what her name was again. "Ruth," she said. "But my brothers called me Ruthie." "Ruthie," he repeated, testing the word like a coin he had never handled. And she, who had learned long ago not to smile at men who could still hurt her, allowed the corner of her mouth to lift, and the room, for one small, measured second, felt warmer than it had in a year. Celestina came home that weekend smelling of another man's cologne. She did not bother to hide it. She swept through the house in a dress the color of oxblood, kissed Damiano on the forehead, the way one kisses an urn, and said perhaps it would be healthier for them both if she took the guest wing until he was more himself. Damiano, who had once put 3 men in the harbor for less, said only, "As you wish." She paused at the door and, without turning, added, "Oh, and the new girl, Ruth. She's a bit familiar, don't you think? Perhaps we should find someone more suitable." Damiano's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "She stays," he said, and the 2 small words came out of him with the weight of an old command, the first he had issued in his own house since the bullet. Celestina's shoulders rose and fell in a laugh so small it could have been a breath. "Of course, darling. Whatever amuses you." That night, from the 3rd-floor landing, Ruth watched Celestina slip out to a black car at the gate. The man behind the wheel was not a driver. Ruth had grown up in a town where women knew the difference. She said nothing the next morning. She only brought his coffee 2 shades stronger than he liked, and sat with him while he read the paper. And when he asked why she watched him so closely, she said, "Because you look like a man who is being lied to, and I want to be sure I'm not the one doing it." He set the paper down. He did not answer, but that afternoon he asked her to wheel him to the study, and he asked her to close the door, and he asked her, in a voice so quiet she had to lean in, whether she was afraid of him. "No, sir," she said. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "Most people," Ruth said, "haven't buried a husband. After you bury one, the rest of the world gets smaller." Damiano Vasquez, who had built his empire on the ability to read men, looked at this woman with her strong hands and her steady mouth, and understood, for the first time since the bullet, that he was not alone in the house. The empire, meanwhile, was rotting from the inside. Damiano had been out of the daily business for 6 months, and 6 months in the world he came from was a lifetime. His underboss, a broad, careful man named Marco Belandi, had been running the docks in his absence. Marco visited on Sundays with a briefcase and a smile that never quite reached his teeth. He brought numbers that were always just slightly too clean, envelopes that were always just slightly too thin, and news that was always just slightly too calm. Damiano, who had once counted a man's lies by watching the pulse in his throat, could still count. He said nothing to Marco. He nodded. He signed the papers. He let Marco believe that the chair had made him stupid as well as still. But at night, when Ruthie had settled him and gone to her room above the garage, he lay in the dark and did arithmetic. 6 months of skimmed shipments, 6 months of union dues going to an account he did not recognize. 6 months of a fiancé slipping out at midnight to meet a man whose cologne Damiano had smelled once on the collar of Marco Bellandi's coat. He thought of the bullet on the rainy Tuesday in March, and how the shooter had known exactly where his coat thinned, and he understood, with the slow, cold certainty of a man used to bad news, that the sedan had not been sent by an enemy, it had been sent by a friend. He said nothing for 3 days. He only counted the ways a wounded animal can still bite, and slowly, in that dark room, began sharpening the one tooth he had left. Ruth noticed the shift in him before he spoke of it. He began to ask her questions that had nothing to do with his body. He asked her whether the gate guard had changed his rotation. He asked her whether the delivery van from the grocer arrived at the same hour each Tuesday. He asked her, on a gray Thursday in September, whether she knew how to drive a stick. "I grew up on a farm, Mr. Vasquez," she said. "I could drive a tractor before I could spell my name." He almost smiled. He asked her that evening whether she would run an errand his own men could not know about. Ruth set down the tray she was carrying. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at him on that first morning, and she said, "Mr. Vasquez, before I answer, I need you to tell me the truth about one thing. Am I in danger in this house?" He did not lie to her. He never would again. "Yes," he said. "You have been in danger since the day my fiancée hired you. She hired you because she thought you were plain and forgettable, and she was wrong on both counts. If they decide you have seen too much, they will not ask permission before they act." Ruth was quiet for a long time. She thought of her small suitcase in the room above the garage, and of the bus fare and the coffee tin under her bed, and of the 2 brothers back in Kentucky who would grieve her if she vanished. Then she picked up the tray again and she said, "Then tell me the errand, Mr. Vasquez. I'd rather be useful than forgettable." That night, Damiano gave her a key, an address on the north side of Port Halden, and the name of a man who owed him a debt older than the injury. He told her what to say and what not to say, and he told her that if anything felt wrong, she was to walk away and never speak of it again. Ruth nodded once, tucked the key into the pocket of her apron, and went to make his supper. The errand went cleanly. The man at the address was an old accountant named Silvio Marchetti, a small man with careful eyes who had been keeping Damiano's private books since before Marco Bellandi had learned to shave. Ruth delivered the message. She waited while Silvio wrote a reply in a hand so small it looked like insect tracks. She brought it home in the lining of her coat, past the gate guard who barely glanced at her, past the 2 men in the kitchen who did not think a maid worth watching, past Celestina on the sunroom telephone, who did not even look up. When Damiano read the paper, his face did something Ruth had never seen it do. It went the color of paper, and then it went the color of iron. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said, "that I owe you more than a salary." She did not ask what the paper said. She only refilled his water glass, adjusted the blanket over his knees, and told him that supper would be ready in 20 minutes. But that night, when she brought him his medication, he caught her wrist. His grip was not the grip of a sick man. It was the grip of the man he had been before the bullet. And for one startled instant, Ruth understood exactly why the city had feared him. "Ruthie," he said, "if I asked you to leave this house tonight, to take a car and drive south until the license plates changed color, would you go?" She looked down at his hand around her wrist. She did not pull away. "No, Mr. Vasquez," she said, "I would not." Why? She thought about it. She thought about her husband under the mountain, and about the 2 brothers she had raised, and about every man who had ever told her she was too much woman and not enough wife. And she said, "Because I have spent my whole life being sent away from rooms where I was needed, I am not going anywhere." He let go of her wrist, but the shape of his fingers stayed on her skin long after she had gone to her own bed, and she lay awake in the dark above the garage, listening to the ocean, and knew that she had chosen a side in a war she did not yet fully understand. Celestina came home the following weekend with a new bracelet and a new plan. She sat on the edge of Damiano's bed, took his hand between hers, and told him, in a voice sweet as spoiled honey, that his doctors had recommended a specialist in Zurich. A world-renowned surgeon, she said, a man who worked miracles on spines. She had already made the arrangements, a private plane in 10 days. She would go with him herself, of course. She would not dream of letting him make the journey alone. Damiano listened. He nodded in the right places. He asked the right questions about the surgeon's credentials and the length of the stay. He asked, mildly, whether the plane had been fully inspected, and Celestina answered, mildly, that of course it had. And when she had kissed his forehead again and gone downstairs to make her calls, he turned to Ruth, who had been standing quietly by the window, and he said, "She means to kill me on that plane." Ruth did not gasp. She did not argue. She only crossed to the door, closed it softly, and came back to sit in the chair beside his bed. "Tell me what you need me to do, Mr. Vasquez," she said. And Damiano Vasquez, who had trusted 3 people in his entire life and buried 2 of them, told her everything. The plan Celestina and Marco Bellondi had cooked up was elegant in the way that cruel things often are. The specialist in Zurich was real, but the plane would never reach him. Somewhere over the Atlantic there would be a sudden decompression, a medical emergency, a body that could not be revived because the man attending him had been paid to look the other way. Celestina would land in Switzerland a grieving fiancé. She would inherit, through a will Damiano did not remember signing, a controlling interest in the shipping company. Marco would take the docks. The 2 of them would marry within the year, and Port Halden would go on turning as if a king had never fallen. Silvio Marchetti's tiny handwriting had laid it out on a single sheet of onion skin paper, along with the account numbers where the skimmed money had been going, and the name of the pilot who had been bought, and the name of the doctor, and, at the bottom, a small pencil-drawn map of the boathouse at the end of the Vasquez dock, where Marco liked to meet Celestina on Thursday nights, because he believed no one could see them there. Damiano folded the paper into quarters and asked Ruth to burn it in the fireplace. She did. They watched it curl into black lace together, and neither of them spoke until the last edge had gone to ash. Then Damiano said very quietly, "I am going to need you to be braver than any woman I have ever known, and I am going to need you to forgive me for asking." Ruth did not answer with a word. She only refilled his glass, straightened the blanket over his knees, and nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has already decided. For the next week, Damiano did something he had not done since the bullet. He began to work. Not the work of a boss barking orders, but the slow, patient work of a man laying a snare. He asked Ruth to bring him a laptop, an old one, nothing traceable, and he asked her to help him learn to use it because his hands, once so fast on a pistol, had grown clumsy with disuse. He dictated letters. He made calls on a burner phone Ruth bought from a corner store in a neighborhood where nobody asked questions. He reached out to little Sal, his old driver, a wiry man of 60 who had wept at his hospital bed and been quietly cut out of the household by Celestina within a month. Sal came in through the kitchen door at 2 in the morning, hat in his hands, and when he saw Damiano sitting up in the chair with a plan in his eyes, he crossed himself and said, "Boss, I thought you were gone." "I was, Sal," Damiano said. "This woman brought me back." Sal looked at Ruth, standing in the doorway with a plate of sandwiches she had made without being asked, and Sal, who had seen every kind of woman a rich and dangerous man could attract, nodded once, slowly, in a way that meant he understood exactly what he was looking at. From that night on, there were 3 of them in the conspiracy, then 4, when Father Emile, the old parish priest who had baptized Damiano and refused ever after to be afraid of him, agreed to hold a certain envelope in the church safe until it was called for. Then 5, when a young detective named Inez Ordway, who had been on Marco Bellondi's payroll and had recently discovered that Marco intended to cut her loose the moment his takeover was complete, made a quiet phone call to a number she had once been told to memorize and never dial. Inez came to the house in a plain coat and sat across from Damiano for 2 hours, and when she left she carried a small recording device in her purse and a promise, on both sides, that neither of them would ever mention the meeting aloud again. Meanwhile, Ruth was doing something Damiano had not asked her to do, and did not at first know she was doing. Every morning she woke him at 6. Every morning she moved his legs through a range of motion the physical therapist had prescribed, and Celestina had dismissed as a waste of time. She pressed his heels, she flexed his ankles, She massaged the long muscles of his thighs until the blood came back into them pink and warm. She spoke to him while she worked, not baby talk, not pity, but the ordinary talk of two people sharing a room, the weather, the price of tomatoes, a memory of her father teaching her to shoot a squirrel out of a walnut tree when she was 9. She told him about her mother's biscuits, and about the schoolhouse fire the year she was 10, and about the way the mist sat in the hollow on autumn mornings, like something that had come to visit and forgotten to leave. He listened. He had spent 30 years listening to men who wanted something from him, and he had forgotten what it sounded like to be told a story that asked nothing back. And on the 9th morning of the 2nd week, while she was bending his right knee, Damiano gasped. Not from pain, from sensation. A single, thin, electric thread of feeling had run from his hip to the arch of his foot, and it had felt, he said, like a match being struck inside a cave. Ruth froze. Then she set his leg down very carefully, and she said, in a voice that trembled for the first time since he had known her, "Mr. Vasquez, do that again. Whatever you just did in your head, do it again." He did. The thread came back. It was thin. It was unreliable. It would come and go over the days that followed like a radio station on a mountain road. But it was there. Ruth did not tell anyone. She did not tell Sal. She did not tell Father Emile. She certainly did not tell Celestina. She only kept working his legs, and she began, without discussing it with him, to add exercises for his back and his core, the muscles that would have to hold him upright if the thread ever grew into a rope. Damiano watched her working over him one afternoon, sweat on her brow, a strand of hair stuck to her cheek, and he said, "Ruthie, why are you doing this?" She did not look up. "Because you're going to need to sit up straight when you look your fiancée in the eye and tell her what you know, and I want you to be able to do it without me holding your shoulders." He laughed for the first time since the bullet. It was a short laugh, and it hurt his ribs, and it was the most beautiful sound Ruth had ever heard in that house. The trap was set for a Thursday. Celestina was to meet Marco at the boathouse at 10 in the evening, as she always did. Detective Ordway had agreed to be in the reeds with a recorder and 2 officers she trusted. Little Sal would have a car at the top of the drive. Father Emile would be in the study with the envelope, ready to go to the newspapers at midnight if a certain phone call did not come. And Damiano would be in the house, in his chair, at the window that overlooked the dock, so that when it was done he could see with his own eyes the end of the people who had tried to bury him alive. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It fell apart at 9:47. Celestina, it turned out, was not a fool. She had noticed the change in Damiano, the color in his face, the way his eyes tracked her across a room, the way Ruth Callahan no longer averted her gaze when spoken to. She had noticed the burner phone once, when the maid had forgotten it on the sill of the pantry window. She had noticed the extra hour Ruth spent in the master's suite in the evenings, and the low, steady sound of 2 voices talking behind a closed door. On Thursday afternoon, without warning, Celestina fired the entire household staff. She told them to be off the property by 7. She told Ruth, specifically, that her services would no longer be required, that a car had been arranged to take her to the train station, and that any personal effects left behind would be forwarded. She said all of this in the entrance hall, in front of 2 men in dark coats who had not been on the estate before, and whose hands stayed inside their jackets while she spoke. Ruth understood, in the way a woman raised in a hollow understands the click of a shotgun in another room, that if she got into that car, she would not reach the train station. She smiled at Celestina. She thanked her for the opportunity. She said, in a voice as flat as a Kentucky creek in August, that she would need 20 minutes to pack. Celestina, who had never in her life been refused a schedule by a servant, waved her off with a jeweled hand. Ruth went upstairs to pack a single small bag, and then, instead of going down the front staircase, she went along the servants' corridor into the master's suite, and she told Damiano, in a low, steady voice, that the plan had just moved forward by 3 hours, and that he needed to decide, right now, whether he trusted her with his life. He did. He had for weeks. He simply had not said the word. He said it now. "Yes, Ruthie, do it." What Ruth did next was the thing Damiano would remember for the rest of his days, and would tell, in fragments, to their children many years later. She wheeled him to the service elevator. She took him down to the kitchen. She took him out through the herb garden and along the low stone wall that separated the estate from the cliff path. She did this while two armed men waited in the front hall for her to come down with her suitcase, and while Celestina sipped a glass of wine in the sitting room and looked at her watch. The wind off the water was cold and salt-heavy, and the gravel bit into Ruth's palms where she braced the chair against the slope, and Damiano, who had been carried by so many hands in the past year that he had stopped counting, understood suddenly that he had never once, in any of those hands, felt as safe as he did in these. Ruth did not go to the boathouse. She went past it, along the rocks, to a small tender skiff that little Sal had, at Damiano's instruction, moored there the night before. She lifted Damiano out of the chair, 170 pounds of paralyzed man, with the strength of a woman who had lifted heavier weights in worse conditions, and she laid him in the bottom of the skiff on a folded blanket. She pushed off. She rowed, in the dark, along the shoreline, until she reached the small wooden pier where little Sal was waiting with the car. Sal saw the two of them coming out of the water like something from an old story, and he wept, and he said nothing, and he drove them, not away from the estate, but to the little wooden chapel on the bluff where Father Emile was waiting with a telephone in one hand and the envelope in the other. From the chapel, Damiano made 3 calls. The first was to Detective Ordway, telling her that the meeting at the boathouse was still on, but that the men she needed to arrest were no longer only his fiancé and his underboss, but also the 2 men Celestina had brought into the house that afternoon, who were, at that very moment, still standing in his front hall waiting for a woman who was not coming down. He gave her the make of their car. He gave her the license plate. He gave her the name of the man who had hired them, and the name of the man that man reported to. And he told her, quietly, that if she moved fast enough, she would sweep 3 tiers of Marco Belandi's operation off the board in a single night. The second call was to a reporter at the Port Halden Ledger, an old friend, who was given the address of the boathouse, the time of the meeting, and the name Silvio Marchetti, and told to bring a photographer and to trust nothing that came out of the police press office until she had confirmed it with the detective in charge. The third call was to Marco Belandi himself. Damiano let the phone ring 4 times. When Marco answered, warily, Damiano said only, "The docks were never yours, Marco. They were only lent." And then he hung up. He turned to Ruth, who was standing very still in the doorway of the chapel with her hair wet from the sea, and he said, "Wheel me to the window, please. I would like to watch the lights." They watched from the chapel window as, across the water, the boathouse lit up with the blue and red of police lights. They watched a small boat pull away from the far side of the dock too late and be intercepted by a Coast Guard vessel that had, apparently, received a tip. They watched the front hall of the great house light up as officers went in through the front and the servants' door at once. Celestina did not resist. She was not, in the end, a brave woman. She only cried prettily and asked for her lawyer, and later, in a photograph that ran on the front page of every paper in Port Halden, she was shown in handcuffs with her diamond still on her finger and her lipstick still perfect, and her eyes, for the first time in her life, entirely emptied of what she had believed was power. Marco Belandi did resist, and he was carried out of the boathouse on a stretcher with a bullet in his shoulder from an officer who did not miss. The 2 men in the front hall dropped their weapons the moment they realized they had been left holding a trap for a woman who had never been coming down the stairs. And Damiano Vasquez sat in his chair, in a country church he had not entered since his mother's funeral, and watched the empire he had built on fear come apart in a single hour, because a woman from a hollow in Kentucky had refused to leave a room when a rich woman told her to. The days that followed were not romantic. They were paperwork. They were statements to prosecutors and long meetings with lawyers and the slow, careful business of extracting a man from a life he no longer wanted to lead. Damiano gave the shipping company to the union that had worked it for 3 generations, minus a percentage that went, quietly, to a fund for the widows of dock workers. He gave the great house to the archdiocese on the condition that it be turned into a rehabilitation home for people with spinal injuries, and that Father Emile be allowed to name the chapel. He kept, for himself, only the small stone cottage at the far edge of the property, the one that had belonged to the estate's gardener when he was a boy, and the small boat Ruth had rowed him away in. Celestina was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. She got 15 years, and she served them in a facility upstate where the wind came off a different kind of water, and the diamonds she had once counted on her fingers were replaced by the numbers on a green cotton shirt. Marco Bellondi got 22 and did not last 5, because a man who has spent his career selling out his own captains does not fare well in the yards where those captains have friends. Detective Ordway, who had turned state's evidence and worn a wire in a way that put a dozen bigger names on prosecutors' desks, was quietly reassigned to a small town upstate where nobody knew her name, and where, in time, she became the sort of officer she had once believed she could not be. And Ruth Callahan, who had come north for the pay, stayed, because when Damiano asked her to, she found that she had no reason to say no, and every reason to say yes. He did not propose to her in a rush. He did not, as some men in his old world would have, offer her a ring the size of an insult. He waited until the thread of feeling in his legs had grown into a rope, and the rope into a cable, and the cable into the ability to stand, with a walker, for the length of time it took to cross a small kitchen. He waited until she had gone home to Kentucky for 2 weeks to see her brothers, and had, of her own accord, come back, stepping off the bus in Port Halden with the same small suitcase she had arrived with a year and a lifetime before. He waited until a spring evening on the porch of the cottage, when the sea was quiet and the light was low, and a mourning dove was calling from the pine at the end of the drive, and he took her hand between his and he said, "Ruthie, I am not the man I was. I am not going to be the man I was. I have very little to offer you but a small house and a slow walk and the rest of my life. Will you take it?" And Ruth Callahan, who had buried one husband and raised 2 brothers, and rode a paralyzed king out of his own castle in the dark, looked at Damiano Vasquez and said, "Mr. Vasquez, I have been taking it since the first morning. You are only just now catching up." They were married in the chapel on the bluff by Father Emile, in front of little Sal and a handful of dock workers' widows, and a nervous young reporter from the Port Halden Ledger. She wore a pale blue dress. He stood, with the walker, for the length of the vows, and then he sat, and she sat beside him, and nobody in the chapel thought less of either of them for it. There is a photograph, taken that day, that hangs still in the front room of the small stone cottage. In it, Damiano is in his chair, and Ruth is standing behind him with one hand on his shoulder, and they are both looking not at the camera, but at each other. And the look on their faces is the look of 2 people who have walked, together, out of a house that was trying to eat them, and have decided to build something smaller and truer on the other side. The city of Port Halden went on without its king. The docks went on turning. The newspapers, after a season of headlines, moved on to other scandals. And in a small stone cottage at the edge of a cliff, a man who had once been feared, and a woman who had never been noticed, made coffee in the morning and read the paper together, and argued gently about the price of tomatoes, and were, for the first time in either of their lives, exactly where they belonged. Damiano would sometimes, in the years that followed, wheel himself to the edge of the cliff at sunset and look down at the water where Ruth had rowed him away, and he would remember the sound of the oars and the shape of her shoulders against the dark, and he would understand, again, that a bullet had taken his legs, but a woman had given him back his life. And Ruth, watching him from the kitchen window with her hands in a bowl of flour, would sometimes catch him at it, and she would shake her head and smile, and she would call out, in the plain, flat voice of a woman who had never learned to flatter, "Mr. Vasquez, supper in 20 minutes. Don't be dramatic." And he, king of nothing now but a small warm kitchen and the woman inside it, would laugh in the low, unhurried way of a man who had stopped running out of time, and would turn the chair and come home along the shell path to the only country he had ever truly wanted to live in, a country whose border was the width of a doorway, and whose treasury was the weight of one steady hand on his shoulder in the lamplight of the kitchen door.